Sometimes love makes you do impossible things. Sometimes it makes you risk everything for the one person who matters most. Jack Sterling stood on the tarmac in his worn flight suit, holding his old helmet while a man in an expensive tuxedo pointed and laughed. Behind them, hundreds of wealthy guests watched from their seats, champagne glasses glinting in the sunset. The corporate jets gleamed like jewels, but Jack's old military aircraft looked tired and forgotten. Everyone saw a desperate father past his prime, chasing an impossible flight record. What they didn't see was his 17-year-old daughter Olivia, sick with a rare condition that would bankrupt them. She dreamed of flying like her dad, but time was running out. Jack had spent months restoring this jet, pouring his life savings into one last chance. He wasn't chasing glory, he was chasing hope. But would a father's love be enough to prove them all wrong? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced the pre-dawn darkness at 4:30 a.m., the same time it had sounded every morning for the past 3 years. Jack Sterling's weathered hand slapped the snooze button with practiced precision, his body already moving through the familiar routine that had become his lifeline to sanity. The small ranch house in Palmdale, California, bore the quiet dignity of a home that had seen better days. Family photos lined the hallway walls, pictures of happier times when Sarah was alive, when Olivia was small enough to sit on his shoulders at air shows, when the future seemed as limitless as the desert sky above their home. The mortgage papers tucked behind one frame served as a daily reminder of just how precarious their situation had become. In the kitchen, Jack measured coffee with the same precision he'd once used to calculate fuel loads for combat missions. The machine gurgled to life, filling the silence with its familiar rhythm. Through the window, he could see his neighbor's sprinkler system painting arcs across their manicured lawn, a luxury he'd given up 6 months ago when the medical bills started arriving in earnest. "Morning, Dad!" Olivia's voice carried a forced brightness that broke his heart every time he heard it. She moved carefully down the hallway, one hand trailing along the wall for support, though she tried to make it look casual. At 17, she possessed her mother's graceful beauty and stubborn streak, combined with Jack's keen intelligence and love for all things aviation. "Morning, sweetheart. How are you feeling today?" "Good," she lied, settling into her chair at the small breakfast table. The family photo sitting there showed the 3 of them at Edwards Air Force Base during an open house 7 years ago. Sarah's arm was wrapped around Jack's waist, Olivia perched on his shoulders with her hands spread like wings. None of them could have imagined then that Sarah would be gone within 2 years, claimed by a drunk driver on Highway 14. Jack studied his daughter's face as she reached for the orange juice. The slight tremor in her hands had worsened over the past month, and the dark circles under her eyes spoke of nights spent fighting symptoms she refused to discuss. The doctors called it Friedreich's ataxia, a rare genetic disorder that attacked the nervous system with ruthless precision. The prognosis was clear. Without intervention, Olivia would lose her ability to walk, speak, and eventually breathe on her own. "I've been researching that experimental treatment program at Johns Hopkins," Olivia said, her voice carefully neutral as she buttered her toast. "The one Dr. Martinez mentioned." Jack's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. They'd been dancing around this conversation for weeks. "Olivia, I know what it costs, Dad. I'm not stupid." Her green eyes, so much like her mother's, met his with unwavering directness. $200,000 for the full treatment protocol. Maybe more if there are complications. The number hung between them like a physical presence. Jack's annual salary as a cargo pilot barely covered their current expenses, even with the overtime shifts he'd been pulling. Their insurance company had already denied coverage, claiming the treatment was experimental and not medically necessary. A phrase that had haunted Jack's dreams for months. "I'm looking into options," he said finally. "What options?" Olivia's tone was gentle but insistent. "We've already mortgaged the house once. Your credit cards are maxed out from Mom's medical bills. And before you even think about it, I won't let you cash out your military pension early." Sometimes Jack wondered when his daughter had become the adult in their relationship. Sarah's death had forced them both to grow up fast, but Olivia had shouldered burdens that would challenge people twice her age. She managed their household budget with mathematical precision, researched her own medical condition with scientific thoroughness, and somehow maintained a 4.0 GPA while her world slowly crumbled around her. "There might be something," Jack said quietly, his eyes fixed on the family photo. "Something I've been considering." Before Olivia could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from dispatch. Another early morning cargo run to Phoenix, hauling auto parts across the desert. The pay was decent, but it meant another 12-hour day away from home, another day closer to the deadline that loomed over everything they did. "Go," Olivia said, reading his expression. "Mrs. Henderson is picking me up for school anyway." Jack kissed the top of his daughter's head, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo mixed with the faint medicinal smell that had become part of their daily reality. "I'll be home by 6. We'll order pizza and watch one of those terrible aviation movies you love. The ones where the physics make you cringe. Those are the best kind." After Jack left, Olivia sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the family photo. Her trembling fingers traced the outline of her father's face, remembering when he'd seemed invincible in his Air Force uniform. Colonel Jack Sterling had flown F-16s in 2 wars, earned a chest full of medals, and commanded the respect of everyone who knew him. But even heroes, she was learning, had limits. The garage workshop had become Jack's sanctuary over the past year. What had started as a hobby, restoring a 1952 North American F-86 Sabre he'd purchased from a military surplus auction, had evolved into something approaching obsession. The sleek fighter jet, painted in classic silver with blue trim, represented everything Jack had loved about flying before bureaucracy and grief had worn down his edges. Most evenings after work, he could be found hunched over the aircraft's engine compartment, methodically rebuilding systems that hadn't seen active duty since the Korean War. The work was meditative, each bolt and wire a puzzle piece in a larger picture he was slowly bringing back to life. The F-86 had been America's premier fighter in its day, capable of speeds that had seemed impossible when it first took to the skies. Now, as Jack ran his hands along the aircraft's fuselage, he allowed himself to imagine what it might feel like to push this machine to its absolute limits. The Continental Speed Challenge was accepting entries for another 6 days. The prize money, $2 million for breaking the transcontinental speed record, would solve every problem that kept him awake at night. It was a foolish dream, he knew. The current record holder, Marcus Webb, had achieved his time in a modified corporate jet worth more than Jack's house. Webb was 15 years younger, backed by a team of professional mechanics and engineers, and possessed resources that made Jack's garage workshop look like a children's toy box. But the F-86 had capabilities that corporate jets lacked. In the right hands, with the right modifications, it might just be fast enough. The question wasn't whether the aircraft could break the record. The question was whether Jack Sterling still had what it took to fly like the pilot he'd once been. His phone rang, interrupting his reverie. The caller ID showed his old squadron mate Pete Kowalski, calling from Phoenix. "Jackie boy," Pete's gravelly voice carried decades of friendship and shared experience. "Heard through the grapevine that you're thinking about doing something spectacularly stupid. News travels fast, faster than you think. Marcus Webb's been making inquiries about a certain Air Force retiree who might be foolish enough to challenge his record. Word is, he's not particularly worried." Jack felt a familiar stirring in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced before every combat mission. Fear and excitement intertwined, creating a cocktail of adrenaline that had sustained him through 22 years of military service. Maybe he should be. The call came at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday that had started like any other. Jack was 20 minutes into his cargo run to Las Vegas when his phone lit up with Palmdale High School's number. He pulled over immediately, hazard lights flashing against the desert backdrop. "Mr. Sterling, this is Principal Morrison. Olivia collapsed during chemistry class. The paramedics are taking her to Antelope Valley Hospital right now. The stack of medical bills sat on the kitchen table like an accusation, each envelope bearing the familiar logo of Antelope Valley Medical Center. Jack's hands shook as he sorted through them, the numbers blurring together into an incomprehensible sum that represented his daughter's life measured in dollars and cents. $47,000 for the emergency room visit, $23,000 for the MRI and neurological workup, $15,000 for the 3-day hospital stay while they stabilized her condition. And at the bottom of the stack, the letter that made his chest tighten with each reading, a formal denial of coverage from their insurance company. The requested treatment protocol remains experimental, the letter stated in cold, bureaucratic language. Our medical review board has determined that insufficient evidence exists to support coverage for the proposed gene therapy intervention at Johns Hopkins Hospital. Dr. Martinez had been blunt during their consultation the day after Olivia's collapse. The disease is progressing faster than we initially projected, she explained, her kind eyes reflecting the gravity of the situation. Without intervention, we're looking at significant mobility loss within 6 months, respiratory complications within 18 months. And with the treatment, 70% chance of halting progression, 30% chance of actual improvement. But Mr. Sterling, we're talking about a narrow window here. The therapy is most effective in the early stages, and Olivia's condition is advancing rapidly. The window was closing. Every day that passed without treatment reduced their options, and every day the bills mounted higher. Jack had already borrowed against his military pension, maxed out 3 credit cards, and taken a second mortgage on the house. The total wasn't even close to what they needed. That evening, Olivia sat at her desk, supposedly working on homework, but actually researching aviation records on her laptop. Her fingers moved with the careful deliberation of someone fighting against tremors that threatened to betray her condition. "Dad," she called softly, "come look at this." Jack found her staring at a website for the Continental Speed Challenge, an annual competition that attracted the world's most elite pilots. The current transcontinental speed record, Los Angeles to New York in 3 hours, 47 minutes, had stood for 8 years, held by Marcus Webb in his modified Gulfstream G650. "The entry deadline is in 3 days, Olivia said, her voice carefully neutral. "Prize money is $2 million. Jack's breath caught. He'd heard about the competition, of course. Every pilot in Southern California knew about Webb's record, and the standing challenge to anyone brave or foolish enough to attempt breaking it. But he'd never considered it as anything more than a fantasy for rich men with expensive toys. "Olivia, that's not—" "Your F-86 has a theoretical top speed of 687 miles per hour, she interrupted, reading from her research. Webb's record was achieved at an average speed of 673 miles per hour. The math works, Dad. The math might work, but the reality is more complicated than that. Weather, fuel efficiency, navigation, mechanical reliability, there are 1,000 variables that could what? Could kill you." Olivia turned in her chair to face him directly. "Dad, I'm dying anyway." "At least this way we're fighting." The words hit him like a physical blow. In all their conversations about her condition, Olivia had never been so direct, so brutally honest about what they were facing. She'd inherited her mother's strength, but also Sarah's tendency to face hard truths head-on. "Don't talk like that." "Like what?" "Like someone who understands exactly what's happening to her." Olivia's green eyes flashed with determination. "I've read every medical journal article about Friedreich's ataxia. I know the progression timeline. I know what happens if we don't do something soon." That night, Jack lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through calculations and possibilities. The F-86 was mechanically sound. He'd spent months ensuring every system was restored to perfect working order. His piloting skills, while not as sharp as they'd been during his active duty years, were still considerable. The route was straightforward: Los Angeles International to JFK, approximately 2,500 miles of mostly clear airspace. But the competition would attract the world's best pilots, flying the most advanced aircraft money could buy. Webb alone had invested millions in his record-breaking Gulfstream, and he had a team of engineers and meteorologists providing support. Jack would be flying solo in a 70-year-old fighter jet with no backup plan. At 3 a.m., he gave up on sleep and walked to the garage. The F-86 sat under bright fluorescent lights, its silver fuselage gleaming with the care he'd lavished on every surface. He ran his hand along the wing, feeling the slight vibration that spoke of contained power waiting to be unleashed. His phone buzzed with a text message from Pete. "Heard about Olivia's episode. Whatever you're thinking about doing, I'm in." More messages followed throughout the early morning hours. Dave Chen from his old squadron, offering mechanical expertise. Roy Anderson, now a civilian air traffic controller, promising to help navigate weather patterns. One by one, his military brothers checked in, each offering support in their own way. By dawn, Jack had made his decision. He pulled up the Continental Speed Challenge website and began filling out the entry form. The application required proof of aircraft airworthiness, pilot certifications, and a $50,000 entry fee that he didn't have, but would find somehow. "Mr. Sterling?" The voice on the phone belonged to Janet Webb, Marcus Webb's wife and business manager. "I understand you're considering entering our little competition. News travels fast in aviation circles." "Indeed it does. I'm calling as a courtesy, really. My husband has held this record for 8 years, and he's quite protective of it. Are you certain you want to subject yourself and your aircraft to what will likely be a very public disappointment?" Jack felt the familiar surge of competitive fire that had sustained him through 2 decades of military service. "Tell your husband I'll see him at the starting line." "Very well. Though I should mention that Marcus has already begun preparations for this year's attempt. New engines, upgraded avionics, a full support team. He's quite confident that his new setup will extend his record by at least 20 minutes. After hanging up, Jack sat in his workshop, staring at the entry form on his laptop screen. The cursor blinked in the signature field, waiting for him to commit to what might be the most important flight of his life. Behind him, Olivia's voice was soft but steady. "Do it, Dad." He turned to find her standing in the doorway, still in her pajamas, her hair tousled from sleep. But her eyes held the same determination he'd seen in her mother's face before every difficult decision they'd faced together. "This is insane, you know that?" "The best things usually are." Jack clicked submit, officially entering the Continental Speed Challenge. In 6 weeks, he would either achieve the impossible or fail spectacularly in front of the entire aviation world. For Olivia's future, it was a risk he had to take. The morning after Jack submitted his entry, the aviation world took notice. By 7 a.m., 3 local news stations had called requesting interviews. By noon, Aviation Week had published a brief article titled "Korean War Veteran Challenges Speed Record with Vintage Fighter." The tone was respectful but skeptical. Exactly what Jack had expected. Marcus Webb's response came that afternoon, delivered through a carefully staged press conference at Van Nuys Airport. Standing beside his gleaming white Gulfstream G650, Webb addressed a crowd of reporters with the polished confidence of a man accustomed to winning. "I welcome all challengers to the Continental Speed Challenge," Webb said, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "Aviation has always been about pushing boundaries, and I respect anyone willing to test their skills against the current record. Of course, flying a museum piece across the country presents unique challenges that modern aircraft simply don't face." The implication was clear. Jack Sterling was either delusional or desperate, possibly both. That evening, Jack opened the F-86's maintenance logbook, a thick binder filled with meticulous documentation of every repair, upgrade, and modification he'd made over the past 18 months. Each entry was written in his careful engineer's script, recording part numbers, torque specifications, and system tests with military precision. The aircraft was mechanically sound, But sound and capable of breaking a transcontinental speed record were two very different things. The original General Electric J47 engine had been completely rebuilt, its components machined to tolerances that exceeded factory specifications. The fuel system had been upgraded to handle the increased demands of sustained high-speed flight. The navigation equipment, while not as sophisticated as modern GPS systems, was reliable and accurate. But the first major challenge revealed itself during a routine inspection of the engine bay. The turbine blades showed microscopic stress fractures that hadn't been visible during previous examinations. In a normal aircraft, such wear might be acceptable for several more months of operation. For a speed record attempt, where the engine would be pushed to its absolute limits for nearly 4 hours, the fractures represented a potential catastrophic failure. How much? Jack asked the parts supplier, already knowing the answer would be devastating. For a complete set of J47 turbine blades in airworthy condition? If I can find them, you're looking at 40,000 minimum. More likely 50, given the rarity. Jack stared at his bank account balance on his phone screen, $3,247. Even if he sold everything he owned, he couldn't cover the cost of the engine overhaul, much less the other upgrades the aircraft would need to be competitive. His work schedule became punishing. Cargo runs to Phoenix at dawn, then 8 hours of mechanical work in the garage, then 2 hours of flight planning and weather analysis before collapsing into bed near midnight. Olivia watched with growing concern as her father pushed himself beyond reasonable limits. "Dad, you're going to kill yourself before you ever get to the starting line," she said one evening, finding him asleep face down in an engine manual. "I'm fine," Jack mumbled, not lifting his head from the workbench. "No, you're not. You've lost 15 pounds in 3 weeks. You fell asleep during your cargo run yesterday. Pete called to check on you." Jack's head snapped up. Pete was his emergency contact with the cargo company, someone who would only call if there was genuine cause for concern. "He said you sounded confused on the radio, like you weren't sure where you were for a minute," Olivia continued. "Dad, when was the last time you had a full night's sleep?" The truth was Jack couldn't remember. Every spare moment was consumed by preparation for the record attempt. He studied weather patterns over the continental United States, memorizing seasonal wind currents and storm tracks. He calculated fuel consumption rates under various flight profiles. He researched Marcus Webb's previous record flights, looking for any advantage in route planning or tactical approach. But the mechanical challenges kept multiplying. The hydraulic system needed complete replacement, another $15,000. The radio equipment, while functional, lacked the reliability needed for a transcontinental flight, $8,000 for a proper upgrade. The ejection seat, a safety requirement for the competition, hadn't been serviced in 20 years, $12,000 if he could find someone qualified to work on it. "I need help," Jack admitted to himself. Though saying it aloud felt like acknowledging defeat. The first test flight had been scheduled for a Thursday morning, but mechanical problems grounded the aircraft before Jack could even start the engine. A fuel leak in the main tank required 3 days to locate and repair. When they finally traced it to a hairline crack in a fuel line junction, Jack spent another $2,000 on replacement parts. Olivia had been documenting the restoration process, initially for her own interest, but increasingly for a social media audience that was beginning to follow their story. Her Instagram account, Olivia's Flight Dream, had started with photos of her father working on the aircraft. But as news of the speed record attempt spread, followers began asking for regular updates. "People are really invested in this," she told Jack one evening, showing him comments on her latest post. "There's a guy in Texas who's offering to donate turbine blades from his own F-86 restoration project. And look at this. A machinist in Ohio says he'll manufacture parts at cost if we can get him the specifications." For the first time in weeks, Jack felt something approaching hope. The aviation community, particularly among vintage aircraft enthusiasts, was tight-knit and supportive. If people were willing to help, perhaps the impossible might become merely improbable. But the next challenge came from an unexpected source. Jim Bradley, Jack's supervisor at the cargo company, called him into the office on a Friday afternoon. "Jack, you're one of my best pilots, but I'm concerned about your performance lately," Bradley said, his tone serious but not unkind. "Dispatch reports that you've been late for 3 flights this week. Yesterday you radioed in the wrong position twice. I need to know, is everything okay at home?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jack could lie, make excuses, promise to do better, or he could tell the truth and risk losing the job that provided his only steady income. "My daughter is sick," Jack said finally. "I'm trying to find a way to pay for her treatment." Bradley's expression softened. He'd been a pilot for 30 years and had seen careers destroyed by medical expenses. "The speed record thing, I heard about it. Jack, I admire what you're trying to do, but if it affects your flying here, I'll have to ground you. Company policy. I understand. Good, because I'm also going to tell you something off the record. There's a pilot position opening up with FedEx. Better pay, better benefits, better medical coverage. I can put in a word for you, but only if I know you're still the reliable pilot I hired." That night, Jack sat in the garage, staring at the partially disassembled engine of his F-86. The FedEx job would solve their immediate financial problems, but it would also mean abandoning the speed record attempt. The sensible choice was obvious. Olivia found him there at midnight, tools scattered around him, his face hollow with exhaustion. "The engine," she asked, "still needs $40,000 worth of parts I don't have. The GoFundMe page is up to $12,000. Jack looked at his daughter with surprise. "What GoFundMe page?" "The one I started this afternoon, flying for Olivia. It's already been shared 800 times. For a moment, Jack didn't know whether to be proud of his daughter's initiative or embarrassed by their public desperation. But as he watched Olivia's determined expression, he realized she was fighting for their dream with the same fierce dedication he was bringing to the mechanical challenges. "We're really doing this, aren't we?" he said. "We're really doing this." Outside, a desert wind rattled the garage door, carrying with it the scent of sage and possibility. Pride had always been Jack Sterling's greatest strength and most dangerous weakness. For 3 weeks, he'd refused to ask his old squadron mates for more than moral support, determined to prove he could restore the F-86 and mount a credible challenge to the speed record through his own efforts. That resolve crumbled on a Saturday morning when he found himself staring at a seized hydraulic pump that would cost $18,000 to replace, if he could find one at all. The part had been manufactured for exactly 4 years in the 1950s, and most of the surviving units were already installed in museum aircraft or private collections. His phone felt heavy in his hands as he scrolled through his contacts, pausing at names he hadn't called in years. Dave Kowalski, who'd flown F-16s in Iraq and now ran a precision machining shop in San Diego. Mike Rodriguez, a former crew chief who'd become legendary for his ability to rebuild impossible mechanical assemblies from scrap metal. Pete Wilson, whose offer of help had been gathering dust in Jack's voicemail for 2 weeks. The first call was the hardest. "Dave, it's Jack Sterling. I need to swallow my pride and ask for help." By Sunday evening, Jack's garage had been transformed into something resembling a military maintenance depot. Dave had driven up from San Diego with a truck full of machining equipment. Mike had taken vacation time from his job at Edwards Air Force Base to volunteer his expertise. Pete had arrived with 3 other squadron veterans, each carrying toolboxes that had seen decades of service keeping military aircraft airborne. "Jesus." "Jackie," Pete said, examining the F-86's engine compartment, "you've done beautiful work on this restoration. But if you want to break Webb's record, you need to think like we're prepping for a combat mission, not a weekend fly-in." The tool set that would prove most valuable had belonged to Jack's father, a crew chief who'd served in Korea, maintaining the same type of aircraft Jack was now preparing for his record attempt. The worn handles and precisely arranged instruments represented 3 generations of aviation expertise. Passed down through bloodlines and hard-earned experience. Pop would have loved this, Jack murmured, running his fingers over his father's favorite torque wrench. He would have called you crazy, Dave replied, grinning. Then he would have rolled up his sleeves and helped anyway. Olivia had become the unofficial documentarian of the restoration effort, her social media following growing daily as people around the world followed their progress. The GoFundMe campaign had exceeded $25,000, with donations arriving from as far away as Australia and Norway. Aviation enthusiasts, military veterans, and people inspired by their story contributed whatever they could afford. There's a message here from a woman in Germany, Olivia told her father during a break in the work. Her husband died of the same condition I have. She says watching us fight gives her hope that maybe his death meant something. The weight of external expectations was becoming as challenging as the mechanical obstacles they faced. Jack had entered the competition to save his daughter's life, but their story had somehow evolved into something larger, a symbol of determination in the face of impossible odds. Marcus Webb's response to their growing media attention was swift and calculated. During a television interview on aviation this week, he expressed admiration for Jack's passion and dedication while subtly questioning whether a vintage aircraft could safely maintain the speeds necessary for a legitimate record attempt. The Continental Speed Challenge has always prioritized safety alongside performance, Webb said, his tone measured and professional. While I respect Mr. Sterling's enthusiasm, the FAA inspection requirements exist for good reasons. Pushing a 70-year-old fighter jet to its absolute limits presents risks that modern aircraft simply don't face. The psychological warfare was effective. By Tuesday, Jack had received 3 separate calls from contest officials expressing concern about his aircraft's suitability for the competition. The implications were clear. Withdraw voluntarily, or face the possibility of being disqualified on technical grounds. They're trying to psych you out, Mike observed, looking up from the fuel system he was rebuilding. Classic intimidation tactics. Webb's worried, or he wouldn't be bothering with the games. The breakthrough came on Wednesday afternoon when Dave successfully manufactured a replacement hydraulic pump using specifications he'd reverse-engineered from the original unit. The new pump was actually superior to the factory original, incorporating modern materials and tighter tolerances while maintaining complete compatibility with the aircraft's vintage systems. Field test this weekend? Dave asked, wiping his hands on a rag stained with hydraulic fluid. Field test this weekend, Jack confirmed, but the first serious flight test revealed new challenges. The F-86 flew beautifully at normal cruising speeds, its controls responsive and its systems functioning flawlessly. At maximum power, however, vibrations in the airframe suggested that sustained high-speed flight would stress the aircraft beyond its design limits. She's not happy at 700 miles per hour, Jack reported after landing, his face grim. Control surfaces are marginal, and I felt flutter in the left wing at maximum speed. Pete studied the aircraft specifications, cross-referencing performance data with weather conditions and route variables. What if you don't try to match Webb's peak speed? What if you optimize for sustained cruise speed instead of maximum velocity? The strategy that emerged from their analysis was counterintuitive but mathematically sound. Instead of pushing the F-86 to its absolute limits, Jack would fly at 85% of maximum power, trading peak speed for fuel efficiency and mechanical reliability. The route would be planned to take advantage of seasonal wind patterns, using jet stream currents to supplement the aircraft's forward velocity. It's like sailing, Olivia observed, studying their calculations. You're not trying to overpower the wind, you're trying to work with it. The community support extended beyond financial contributions. A retired Air Force meteorologist volunteered to provide detailed weather analysis for the record attempt. A former test pilot offered to fly chase plane duties, monitoring Jack's aircraft performance from a nearby position. Even the local airport manager waived hangar fees, acknowledging that their story had brought positive attention to the airfield. but challenges continued to emerge. The insurance company required additional safety inspections that would cost $8,000. Contest regulations demanded upgraded communication equipment that hadn't existed when the F-86 was originally designed. Each solution created new problems, and each new problem required creative thinking and financial resources they barely possessed. Marcus Webb's psychological campaign intensified as the competition date approached. Aviation blogs began publishing articles questioning Jack's qualifications, highlighting the risks of high-speed flight in vintage aircraft, and suggesting that his attempt was more publicity stunt than serious challenge to the record. "They're afraid of you," Olivia said one evening, showing Jack particularly nasty comments on social media. People don't attack someone they consider harmless. The second test flight was scheduled for a Thursday morning with perfect weather conditions and a completely rebuilt engine. Jack's squadron mates gathered at the airfield, their faces reflecting decades of shared experience and mutual support. The F-86 looked magnificent in the early morning light, its silver fuselage gleaming with the care they'd lavished on every surface. "Remember, this isn't about proving anything to Webb," Pete said as Jack suited up for the flight. "This is about proving to yourself that you still have what it takes." Jack nodded, pulling on his helmet, the same battered piece of equipment he'd worn during countless combat missions decades earlier. As he walked toward the aircraft, he felt the familiar mixture of fear and excitement that had sustained him through 22 years of military flying. This time, the F-86 responded like the thoroughbred it had always been meant to be. The navigation chart spread across Jack's kitchen table was a relic from 1952, its yellowed edges and faded markings telling the story of America's transcontinental airways in the early jet age. Red lines traced the original speed record routes, while blue annotations marked weather stations, emergency landing strips, and geographical landmarks that modern GPS had rendered largely obsolete. "The jet stream patterns shift seasonally," explained Dr. Sarah Foster, the retired Air Force meteorologist who'd volunteered to help plan their route. "In October, you'll have a strong westerly current over the Rocky Mountains that could add 50 miles per hour to your ground speed, if you can get to the right altitude." Jack studied the projected wind patterns, cross-referencing them with his aircraft's performance envelope. The F-86's service ceiling was 48,000 feet, well below the optimal jet stream altitude of 35,000 feet. But within the aircraft's operational range, there were still significant advantages to be gained from careful route planning. Webb's 2016 record flight took the southern route, Olivia observed, pointing to telemetry data she'd gathered from aviation databases. "Avoided weather but gave up wind advantage. Your northern route is riskier but potentially faster." The training flights had been revealing in ways that both encouraged and concerned Jack. His piloting skills, honed by decades of military flying, remained sharp despite 5 years of civilian cargo runs. Muscle memory guided his hands through complex procedures, and his situational awareness adapted quickly to the F-86's unique flight characteristics. But the physical demands of high-performance flying were more challenging than he'd anticipated. 4 hours of sustained high-speed flight would require endurance and focus that his 52-year-old body might not possess. Each test flight left him exhausted, his back aching from the cramped cockpit and his reflexes slightly slower than they'd been in his prime. Marcus Webb's latest psychological gambit came in the form of a formal complaint to the FAA, questioning whether Jack's aircraft modifications constituted a change of category that would disqualify him from the vintage aircraft division of the competition. The complaint was technically baseless. Every modification had been approved by certified inspectors, but it forced Jack to spend 3 days and $2,000 on additional documentation. "He's trying to distract you from actual preparation," Pete observed during one of their strategy sessions. "Classic misdirection. While you're dealing with paperwork, he's optimizing his flight plan." The media attention had become a double-edged blessing. Olivia's social media presence had attracted sponsors. A fuel company offered to donate aviation gas. A helmet manufacturer provided upgraded safety equipment, and a dozen smaller companies contributed parts and services. But the publicity also meant constant interview requests, media appearances, and public expectations that added pressure to an already stressful situation. Channel 7 wants to do a live broadcast from the hangar tomorrow, Olivia reported, scrolling through her phone. And Aviation Weekly is sending a photographer for their cover story. We don't need cover stories, Jack replied, his attention focused on fine-tuning the fuel injection system. We need this engine to run perfectly for 4 hours straight. But even Jack had to admit that the media coverage served their cause. The GoFundMe campaign had reached $47,000, enough to cover the remaining mechanical work and entry fees. More importantly, the story of a father fighting to save his daughter's life had resonated with people far beyond the aviation community. Letters arrived daily from strangers offering support, sharing their own stories of medical challenges, or simply expressing admiration for their determination. A group of Korean War veterans had organized a fundraising event at their VFW post. Elementary school children in Ohio had held a bake sale to contribute to Olivia's treatment fund. The technical breakthrough that changed everything came during the 5th test flight, when Jack discovered that the F-86's optimal performance profile was different from anything in the original specifications. By flying at 42,000 feet, higher than the aircraft was originally designed to operate, he could achieve sustained speeds that approached the theoretical maximum while maintaining acceptable fuel consumption. The air is thinner up there, Dave explained, studying the telemetry data. Less drag, more efficient engine operation. It's risky because you're outside the normal flight envelope, but the numbers work. The risk was significant. At 42,000 feet, the F-86 was operating at the edge of its structural limits. Cabin pressure systems that had been adequate for Korean War operations were stressed beyond their design parameters. Emergency procedures that worked at normal altitudes became questionable at the edge of space, but the performance gains were undeniable. Test flights showed that Jack could maintain 680 miles per hour for extended periods, while consuming fuel at rates that made a transcontinental flight mathematically possible. The margin for error was razor-thin, but it existed. Marcus Webb's intelligence network was apparently more sophisticated than Jack had realized. Within days of their high-altitude testing, contest officials received an anonymous complaint, questioning whether modifications to the F-86's pressurization system constituted illegal alterations to the aircraft's original configuration. They're fishing, Pete observed, reading the official inquiry letter. Looking for any technical violation they can use to disqualify you before the race even starts. The response required another week of documentation, inspections, and legal maneuvering that drained both time and money from their preparation efforts. Every hour spent dealing with bureaucratic challenges was an hour not spent optimizing their flight plan or refining mechanical systems. Olivia's online following had grown to over 50,000 people across various social media platforms, creating a global audience invested in their success. The emotional weight of that support was both inspiring and overwhelming. Messages arrived daily from families facing their own medical crises, military veterans admiring Jack's determination, and aviation enthusiasts following every detail of the restoration process. There's a group of pilots in Australia organizing a watch party for the race, Olivia reported, scrolling through international messages. And someone in Japan is translating our updates into Japanese for aviation forums there. But increased visibility brought unwanted attention as well. Aviation journalists began scrutinizing Jack's military service record, looking for any controversy that might add drama to their coverage. Marcus Webb's public relations team leaked carefully selected information about Jack's financial situation, framing the record attempt as a desperate publicity stunt rather than a legitimate sporting challenge. the most damaging article appeared in Aviation Today, suggesting that Jack's age and recent stress might compromise his judgment during the record attempt. The piece included quotes from unnamed aviation safety experts, expressing concern about the risks of pushing vintage aircraft beyond their design limitations. "They're trying to get inside your head," Mike Rodriguez observed, watching Jack's reaction to the article. "Classic psychological warfare. The question is whether you're going to let them succeed." Jack crumpled the magazine and tossed it in the trash. "Let them talk. We'll do our talking in the air." But privately, the criticism stung. At 52, Jack knew he wasn't the pilot he'd been at 30. His reflexes were slightly slower, his night vision marginally reduced, and his ability to handle G-forces diminished by 2 decades of civilian living. The medical examination, required for contest entry, had revealed elevated blood pressure and early signs of arthritis. In his hands, conditions that wouldn't normally ground a cargo pilot but might prove significant during 4 hours of high-performance flying, the final test flight. Before the competition was scheduled for October 15th, exactly 2 weeks before the record attempt, weather conditions were perfect: clear skies, minimal wind, and stable atmospheric pressure that would allow accurate performance measurements. Jack suited up in his father's old flight gear, the worn leather jacket and helmet serving as talismans connecting him to 3 generations of sterling family aviation heritage. As he walked toward the F-86, the morning sun painted its silver fuselage with golden highlights that made the old fighter look almost new again. "Bring her home safe." "Dad?" Olivia called from the observation area, her voice carrying across the tarmac with perfect clarity. The flight was flawless. Every system performed exactly as designed. The engine ran with mechanical precision, and Jack's piloting felt as natural as breathing. For 45 minutes, he pushed the F-86 through every maneuver it would need to complete during the record attempt, testing not just the aircraft's capabilities, but his own readiness for the challenge ahead. Landing back at Palmdale, Jack felt a quiet confidence he hadn't experienced in months. The F-86 was ready. His team was ready. The only question remaining was whether Marcus Webb was prepared for a real fight. The Purple Heart Medal sat in its worn velvet case on Jack's nightstand, a reminder of the price he'd paid for his country during 2 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. The citation read simply, "For wounds received in action against an enemy force," bureaucratic language that couldn't capture the reality of the roadside bomb that had ended his active military career and left him with chronic back pain that flared during times of stress. Dr. Patricia Wong, the flight surgeon conducting Jack's pre-competition medical examination, had been thorough and unsympathetic. "Your blood pressure is elevated. Your reflexes show slight degradation consistent with your age, and these X-rays indicate significant wear in your cervical spine. I have to ask, Mr. Sterling, are you certain you're physically capable of handling the demands of this flight?" "I've been flying for 30 years, Jack replied, pulling his shirt back on. "I think I know my own limitations. Flying cargo planes at moderate altitudes is considerably different from pushing a fighter jet to its absolute limits for 4 consecutive hours. The G-forces alone could exacerbate your back condition, but Jack had already made his peace with the physical risks. Every morning brought new evidence of Olivia's deteriorating condition: a slight stumble on the stairs, increased difficulty with fine motor tasks, fatigue that no amount of rest seemed to alleviate. The experimental treatment at Johns Hopkins remained their only hope, and the Continental Speed Challenge represented their only realistic path to affording it. Marcus Webb's latest psychological offensive came in the form of a leaked document questioning Jack's military service record. The anonymously sourced report suggested that Jack had been discharged from active duty due to psychological instability following combat, trauma, a malicious distortion of the medical retirement he'd received after his injuries, its character. "Assassination," Pete said, studying the document. "Half-truths twisted to make you look unfit." The question is how they got access to your medical files. The answer came 3 days later when Jack received a call from his former commanding officer, General Patricia Barnes, now serving at the Pentagon. "Jack, I wanted you to hear this from me. Someone with serious pull has been making inquiries about your service record. Official channels requesting documentation under Freedom of Information Act provisions. Any idea who?" The requests are coming through a law firm in Los Angeles that specializes in aviation litigation. Big retainer fees, expensive suits, the kind of operation that corporate executives use when they want something investigated discreetly. Marcus Webb had connections that extended far beyond the aviation community. His family owned a chain of luxury hotels. His wife served on several corporate boards, and his brother-in-law worked as a lobbyist in Washington. If Webb wanted to destroy Jack's reputation, he had the resources and influence to do it systematically, but the smear campaign had an unexpected consequence. Military veterans across the country began rallying to Jack's defense, sharing their own stories of combat service and medical challenges. The VFW post in Palmdale organized a fundraising barbecue that raised $12,000 in a single afternoon. A group of retired Air Force pilots volunteered to provide chase plane support during the record attempt. "They picked the wrong fight," observed Colonel Rita Stevens, Jack's former squadron commander, who'd driven up from San Diego to offer her support. "When you attack one of our own, you attack all of us." Olivia's condition took a sharp turn for the worse during the 3rd week of October. Jack found her collapsed in the kitchen one morning, her breakfast scattered across the floor, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The emergency room visit resulted in another $8,000 in medical bills and a grim prognosis from Dr. Ramirez. "The disease progression is accelerating," she explained during a private consultation. "We're seeing neurological deterioration that suggests we have weeks, not months, before the treatment window closes permanently." That night, Jack sat in his garage, staring at the F-86, while wrestling with doubts that threatened to overwhelm his determination. The aircraft was as ready as he could make it, but was he being selfish in pursuing a dream that might leave Olivia orphaned if something went wrong during the flight? Second thoughts. Olivia's voice came from behind him, startling him from his brooding. "Always. It's what keeps pilots alive." She settled into the chair beside his workbench, moving carefully, but still maintaining the grace that reminded him so much of her mother. "I've been thinking about Mom lately. Remember what she used to say about fear? 'Fear is just excitement without breath,'" Jack quoted, remembering Sarah's favorite saying during his deployment years. She also used to say that the only real failure was not trying at all. "Dad, you've given me 17 years of love and support and adventure. If something happens during this flight, that doesn't change. But if you don't try, and we lose the chance to beat this disease, that would be the real tragedy." The community support continued to grow as news of Jack's challenge spread beyond aviation circles. Local businesses donated services and supplies. The high school organized a pep rally where students created banners and signs supporting Captain Sterling's flight for hope. Even the mayor issued a proclamation declaring, October 29th, Jack Sterling Day in Palmdale. But the most meaningful support came from his old squadron mates, men who'd flown combat missions beside him and understood the depths of his commitment to family. They arrived from across the country during the final week before the competition, setting up an informal command center at the airfield. "Like old times," Dave commented, watching the organized chaos of their preparation efforts. "Except instead of preparing for combat, we're preparing for something that might be even more dangerous." The final systems check revealed that one critical component, the backup oxygen system, was operating at the margin of acceptable performance. Replacing it would cost $3,000 and delay the competition entry by at least a week. Operating without reliable backup oxygen at 42,000 feet would be suicidal if the primary system failed. "We take the risk," Jack decided after studying the alternatives. "We've come too far to let a marginal system stop us now." Marcus Webb's final pre-competition interview aired on Aviation Network the night before their departure for Los Angeles International Airport. Dressed in an expensive suit and standing beside his pristine Gulfstream, Webb projected confidence and competence. "I respect Mr. Sterling's passion," Webb said, his tone measured and professional. "But passion alone doesn't overcome the realities of physics and engineering. My aircraft represents the pinnacle of modern aviation technology, while his represents a noble but ultimately futile attempt to relive past glory." The interviewer pressed him about Jack's military service and the controversy surrounding the leaked documents. Webb's response was carefully calculated to appear magnanimous while reinforcing doubt about Jack's fitness. "Combat veterans deserve our respect and support," Webb said. "But the psychological toll of military service is well documented, and high-performance aviation requires absolute mental clarity. I hope Mr. Sterling recognizes his limitations before putting himself and others at risk." That night, Jack lay awake staring at the ceiling, his mind cycling through every aspect of the flight plan he'd memorized over the past month. Route navigation, weather contingencies, fuel calculations, emergency procedures, every detail had been rehearsed until it became muscle memory. In 12 hours, he would either vindicate a lifetime of aviation expertise or fail spectacularly in front of a global audience. For Olivia's sake, failure was not an option he could accept. The secret military file arrived by courier at 11 p.m., 3 days before the competition. Jack almost didn't answer the door. Unexpected late-night deliveries had become a source of anxiety since Webb's harassment campaign began. But the courier wore a Department of Defense uniform and carried credentials that demanded attention. "Colonel Sterling, I'm Sergeant First Class Briggs from Joint Base Andrews. General Barnes asked me to deliver this personally." The manila envelope bore official DoD markings and Jack's full name in neat block letters. Inside, a handwritten note from his former commanding officer was clipped to a thick folder marked, "Classified, Eyes Only. Jack, some things you should know before you step into that cockpit. What happened in Afghanistan wasn't your fault. The record has been corrected. Time for the truth to come out. Give them hell." Patricia. The classified file contained documentation that Jack had never seen despite living through the events it described. Mission reports from Operation Enduring Freedom, witness statements from surviving personnel, and most shocking of all, a recommendation for the Medal of Honor that had been downgraded to a Purple Heart through administrative interference. According to the official record, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb Sr., Marcus Webb's father, had been the commanding officer responsible for a convoy that came under enemy fire in 2003. When the attack began, Jack had disobeyed direct orders to retreat, instead mounting a rescue operation that saved 17 American lives, including Webb Sr.'s, but the official after-action report told a different story. It described Jack as a reckless pilot who endangered his aircraft and crew through unauthorized combat maneuvers. Webb Sr. had taken credit for the successful rescue while blaming Jack for the casualties. "That occurred during the attack, Dad?" Olivia's voice came from behind him. She'd been unable to sleep, worried about his increasingly erratic behavior as competition pressure mounted. Jack handed her the file, watching her face change as she read through the documents. 20 years of buried truth laid bare in official language that couldn't disguise the magnitude of the injustice. "He destroyed your career to protect his own reputation," Olivia said, her voice tight with anger. "His son's been doing the same thing. The insurance denial, the safety complaints, the leaked medical records, it's all connected. Webb Jr. knows that if I break his record, people will start asking questions about how his father built their family's reputation." The phone rang at midnight. Jack recognized the number. It belonged to investigative journalist Carol Mitchell, who'd been following the story for Aviation Week. "Mr. Sterling, I've been researching Marcus Webb's family history. There are some things you should know about his father's military service. Can we meet tomorrow?" They met at a diner in Lancaster, away from the media circus that had surrounded Jack's preparation efforts. Carol spread a collection of documents across the table: military service records, congressional testimony, and newspaper clippings from the 1980s. Lieutenant Colonel Webb Sr. built his post-military career on being a war hero, Carol explained. Defense contracting, corporate board positions, political appointments, all based on his combat record. But several veterans have contacted me over the years, claiming the official accounts of his service weren't accurate. She showed Jack a letter written by his former wingman, Captain Bruce Hamilton, who died in a training accident in 2010. Hamilton had detailed the true events of the convoy rescue, describing Jack's heroic actions and Webb Sr.'s cowardice under fire. Hamilton tried to get the record corrected through official channels for years. The military bureaucracy stonewalled him. When he finally went to the media, Webb Sr.'s connections ensured the story never saw print. The pattern was clear. Webb Sr. had used his influence to bury the truth about his son's military service, just as his son was now using wealth and connections to sabotage Jack's record attempt. The Continental Speed Challenge wasn't just about aviation. It was about preventing Jack from achieving the kind of public recognition that might lead people to investigate the Webb family's carefully constructed legacy. There's more, Carol continued. I've been investigating Webb Jr.'s speed record from 2016. There are irregularities in the telemetry data that suggest his aircraft was modified beyond legal limits for the competition. She produced technical analysis showing that Webb's Gulfstream had been equipped with experimental engine modifications that violated contest regulations. The modifications had been concealed through sophisticated paperwork, manipulation, and the cooperation of contest officials who'd received significant financial donations from Webb's sponsors. He cheated, Jack asked, though he wasn't entirely surprised, systematically and deliberately. The question is what you want to do with this information. Jack studied the evidence spread across the table. 20 years of injustice, a fraudulent speed record, and a pattern of corruption that extended from military service to civilian competition. The temptation to expose everything was overwhelming, but as he considered his options, Jack realized that vindication wouldn't solve his most pressing problem. Olivia still needed treatment, and the Continental Speed Challenge still represented their best chance to afford it. Exposing Webb's cheating might disqualify him from the competition, but it wouldn't put $2 million in Jack's bank account. I'm going to beat him fairly, Jack said finally. Let the record speak for itself, and if he tries to sabotage your attempt, then we deal with it in the air. That night, Olivia discovered something that changed everything. While researching Webb's corporate connections, she found a paper trail linking his family's holding company to the insurance company that had denied her treatment coverage. Dad, look at this, she said, showing him the corporate filings on her laptop. Webb Industries has a controlling stake in Metropolitan Health Services. They didn't just deny my claim, they did it deliberately to force you into financial desperation. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Webb had orchestrated not just the insurance denial, but probably the leak of Jack's medical records and the anonymous complaints to contest officials. Everything had been designed to prevent Jack from mounting a credible challenge to the speed record. He's been playing chess while we were playing checkers, Jack observed grimly. So what do we do? Jack looked at his daughter, seeing in her face the same determination that had sustained him through 22 years of military service. Webb might have money and connections, but Jack had something more valuable, the support of people who believed in fighting for what was right. We proved that integrity beats corruption every time. The revelation about Webb's systematic campaign added new dimensions to their challenge. This wasn't just about breaking a speed record, it was about exposing a pattern of deception that had shaped both their lives. As Jack prepared for the most important flight of his career, he knew the stakes had never been higher. But for the first time in months, he felt the kind of clarity that had always come before combat missions. The enemy was identified, the mission was clear, and failure was not an option. The good luck charm bracelet jingled softly as Olivia fastened it around her wrist, each small aviation-themed charm representing a shared dream between father and daughter. A tiny propeller from her first airshow at age 5. A miniature F-86 model from the day Jack had bought the aircraft. A pair of wings from her 16th birthday when she'd first soloed in a Cessna. Now, on the morning of the Continental Speed Challenge, she added one more charm. A small silver heart engraved with the words, "Fly safe." Dad, Los Angeles International Airport at dawn resembled a Hollywood production more than an aviation competition. Media trucks lined the perimeter road, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers seeking sunlight. Reporters clutched coffee cups and checked equipment, while camera crews established positions that would capture both takeoff sequences. Jack stood beside his F-86 in the competitor staging area, running through his pre-flight checklist with methodical precision. The aircraft looked magnificent in the golden morning light, its silver fuselage polished to mirror brightness by his squadron mates, who'd worked through the night ensuring every surface was aerodynamically perfect. "Final weather briefing," announced Dr. Foster, approaching with her laptop and a stack of meteorological charts. High-pressure system over the Rockies is holding steady. Jet stream currents are favorable for the northern route, but there's a storm front developing over Kansas that could complicate the final approach to New York. Jack studied the weather patterns, calculating how the changing conditions might affect his fuel consumption and navigation timing. The margin for error was razor-thin. Any significant deviation from his flight plan could cost him the record and Olivia's future. Across the staging area, Marcus Webb's operation resembled a NASCAR pit crew. His pristine Gulfstream G650 was surrounded by technicians in matching uniforms, each specialist focused on optimizing a specific system. A meteorologist provided real-time weather updates through satellite communication. An aerodynamics engineer adjusted wing surfaces for maximum efficiency. A team of mechanics performed final inspections with equipment that cost more than most people's houses. "Impressive setup," observed Pete, watching Webb's team with professional interest. But all that technology won't help him if his pilot can't handle the pressure. Webb himself moved through the crowd of reporters and officials with practiced ease, his expensive flight suit immaculate and his confidence radiating from every gesture. When he spotted Jack, he approached with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sterling, quite a circus you've created here. I hope you realize what you're getting yourself into. I've been flying longer than you've been alive. Webb, I think I can handle 4 hours in the cockpit. 4 hours at speeds your aircraft was never designed to sustain, in weather conditions that could ground commercial traffic, with a backup oxygen system that failed inspection twice." Webb's smile widened. "But please, don't let me discourage you from pursuing your dream." The psychological warfare continued right up to the moment of departure. Webb's public relations team had strategically leaked information about Jack's aircraft modifications, questioning whether the F-86's pressurization system could handle prolonged high-altitude flight. Aviation safety experts, many of whom received consulting fees from Webb's corporate sponsors, expressed grave concerns about the risks Jack was taking, but the attempted sabotage had an unexpected consequence. Every attack on Jack's credibility strengthened the resolve of his supporters. The handful of volunteers who'd helped restore his aircraft had grown into a community of hundreds. Palmdale High School had organized a viewing party in the gymnasium. The local VFW post had chartered buses to LAX so veterans could witness the takeoff in person. "Look at them," Olivia said, gesturing toward the crowd of supporters wearing Flying for Olivia t-shirts. "Win or lose, Dad, you've already proven something important." The final technical inspection had revealed one last challenge. The FAA official conducting the airworthiness review, a man who'd received his position through Political connections that trace back to Webb's lobbying network found multiple irregularities in Jack's documentation. Each complaint required additional paperwork, threatening to delay the competition's start time beyond the weather window. "This is harassment," declared Colonel Stevens, Jack's former squadron commander who'd flown in from San Diego to provide moral support. "Every modification on that aircraft has been approved by certified inspectors. These complaints are spurious and professionally motivated, but bureaucracy moved slowly and the clock was ticking." Jack found himself caught between the need to address official concerns and the pressure to launch before weather conditions deteriorated. Every minute spent dealing with paperwork was a minute lost from optimal flight conditions. The breakthrough came when General Barnes arrived unannounced, her Air Force uniform and Pentagon credentials cutting through bureaucratic resistance like a sword through silk. Within 30 minutes, every regulatory objection had been resolved, and Jack's aircraft was cleared for competition. "Some advantages to having friends in high places," she said quietly, shaking Jack's hand. "Now go show them what real pilots can do." The final pre-flight briefing took place in a hangar adjacent to the staging area, with competition officials explaining rules and safety procedures to the 6 pilots who'd qualified for the challenge. Jack was the oldest competitor by 15 years and the only one flying a vintage aircraft. The others represented the elite of modern aviation, test pilots, air racing champions, and corporate executives with unlimited budgets for aircraft modification. "Gentlemen," announced the competition director, "you'll be taking off in 3-minute intervals, with route confirmation required at 5 checkpoints across the continental United States. Any deviation from approved flight paths or safety violations will result in immediate disqualification. The clock starts when you cross the departure threshold and stops when you land at JFK. Jack's takeoff slot was 4th, giving him the advantage of monitoring weather conditions reported by earlier pilots while avoiding the psychological pressure of leading the pack. As he walked toward his aircraft, he felt the familiar pre-flight tension that had preceded every combat mission, a mixture of fear and anticipation that sharpened his focus to laser intensity. Olivia was waiting beside the F-86, her face bright with pride and worry in equal measure. She'd insisted on coming to Los Angeles despite her worsening condition, determined to see her father off on the most important flight of his life. "Remember what Mom used to say," she whispered, hugging him carefully to avoid disturbing his equipment. "Fear is just excitement without breath." Jack climbed into the cockpit, settling into the ejection seat that had been his office for thousands of hours over 3 decades of flying. The familiar switches and gauges surrounded him like old friends, each instrument calibrated and tested to perfection. As he ran through his startup checklist, muscle memory took over. Guiding his hands through procedures he could perform blindfolded, the engine spooled up with a roar that silenced conversation across the staging area. Jack felt the F-86 come alive beneath him. 70 years of aviation engineering focused on a single purpose, to fly faster and higher than any aircraft before it. Tower. "This is Sterling Heavy requesting clearance for departure. Sterling Heavy. You're cleared for takeoff. Godspeed." As the runway stretched out before him, Jack took one last look at the crowd of supporters who'd believed in an impossible dream. Then he advanced the throttle, feeling decades of preparation distill into this single moment of truth. The original flight plan lay clipped to Jack's kneeboard, its hand-drawn route showing his strategic approach to beating the record despite flying inferior equipment. While Webb's Gulfstream could rely on raw power and advanced avionics, Jack's strategy focused on precision navigation, optimal altitude management, and using weather patterns as a force multiplier. The F-86 lifted off from LAX at exactly 8:47 a.m. Pacific time, its silver wings catching the morning sun as Jack banked northeast toward his first waypoint over Barstow. Behind him, the sprawling metropolis of Los Angeles fell away, replaced by the stark beauty of the Mojave Desert. Ahead lay 2,500 miles of challenging airspace, unpredictable weather, and the most demanding flight of his career, Sterling Heavy. "You're tracking beautifully," came the voice of Roy Anderson, his old squadron mate now working as an air traffic controller. "Weather looks favorable for the first 200 miles. Fly safe, Jackie." Marcus Webb had taken off 6 minutes earlier in his Gulfstream, immediately climbing to 45,000 feet and establishing a ground speed that put him ahead of record pace. The corporate jet's superior thrust-to-weight ratio gave it an enormous advantage during the initial climb phase, and Webb wasn't hesitating to use every bit of his aircraft's capability. "Webb's showing 710 miles per hour over Flagstaff," reported Pete Wilson, who was monitoring radio traffic from the ground. "He's pushing hard early, probably trying to build an insurmountable lead." Jack maintained his planned cruise altitude of 42,000 feet, trusting the strategy he and his team had developed over months of preparation. The F-86's engine was running perfectly, its rebuilt J-47 power plant delivering smooth, consistent thrust at 85% of maximum output. Fuel consumption matched his calculations exactly, giving him confidence that his range planning was accurate. The first checkpoint came at Las Vegas, where both pilots were required to report their position and status to competition officials. Webb checked in first, his time showing him nearly 3 minutes ahead of record pace. Jack's report came 2 minutes later, showing him trailing by approximately 40 miles, but well within his projected timeline. "Fuel and engine status, Sterling?" asked the checkpoint controller. "All systems nominal. Fuel consumption tracking perfectly with flight plan. Projections." What Jack didn't report was the slight vibration he'd begun feeling in the control stick, a barely perceptible tremor that suggested something in the aircraft was operating outside normal parameters. In a cargo flight, such a minor anomaly wouldn't be cause for concern. In a record attempt where every system would be stressed to its limits for 4 consecutive hours, even small problems could cascade into catastrophic failures. The route over the Rocky Mountains tested both pilots' skills as they navigated through complex airspace shared with commercial traffic. Jack's military training gave him advantages in tactical flying that Webb's corporate aviation background couldn't match. While the Gulfstream's autopilot maintained precise headings and altitudes, Jack was hand-flying the F-86, constantly adjusting his flight path to optimize wind conditions and minimize fuel consumption. Sterling Heavy, Denver Center. Be advised of mountain wave activity over the Continental Divide. Several aircraft are reporting severe turbulence between 38,000 and 44,000 feet. Jack acknowledged the warning while studying his options. The turbulence zone sat directly on his planned route, but deviating north or south would add precious minutes to his flight time. Webb's Gulfstream could climb above the weather disturbance, but the F-86's service ceiling made that option impossible. "Sterling Heavy, entering mountain wave area," Jack reported, tightening his harness and preparing for rough air. The turbulence hit with the violence of an artillery barrage. The F-86 bucked and rolled as invisible atmospheric rivers tossed the fighter jet around like a toy. Jack fought to maintain control, his hands working constantly on the stick and rudder pedals to keep the aircraft stable. The G-forces pressed him deep into his ejection seat, then lifted him against his restraint harness as the plane rode the mountain waves like a roller coaster. For 12 minutes, Jack battled through air so turbulent that his instruments became difficult to read. The vibration he'd noticed earlier intensified, and new warning lights began illuminating on his caution panel. But the F-86 proved its Korean War heritage, absorbing punishment that would have torn apart lesser aircraft while maintaining structural integrity. When he finally emerged from the mountain wave zone, Jack was surprised to discover that his ground speed had actually increased during the turbulent passage. The same atmospheric conditions that had made the ride so violent had also provided a significant tailwind, pushing him ahead of his planned timeline. Sterling Heavy, Colorado Springs. Your ground speed is showing 695 miles per hour. Can you confirm? Jack double-checked his navigation instruments, hardly believing the readings. The mountain wave activity had acted like a natural catapult, accelerating him far beyond his aircraft's normal cruise speed. For the first time since takeoff, he was actually gaining on Webb's lead. The psychological boost was enormous. Jack had prepared for this flight, expecting to trail Webb throughout most of the route, hoping to make up time through superior navigation and fuel management. Instead, he found himself in a genuine race, with victory becoming a real possibility rather than a distant dream. Webb's response to Jack's improved performance came through increased radio chatter between the Gulf Stream and its ground support team. Jack could hear fragments of urgent conversations about fuel consumption rates, weather routing, and engine optimization. The corporate jet was being pushed harder than its designers had ever intended, sacrificing mechanical longevity for absolute speed. "Jack, this is Pete. Webb's team is sounding worried on the radio. They're talking about extending his fuel stops or reducing power settings. I think you've got them rattled." The second checkpoint at Kansas City showed Jack had closed the gap to less than 20 miles. Webb was still leading, but his margin was shrinking with every mile. More importantly, Jack's fuel consumption remained within acceptable parameters, while telemetry from Webb's Gulfstream suggested the corporate jet was burning fuel at unsustainable rates. Sterling Heavy, Kansas City Center. We're showing weather building along your route to New York. There's a line of thunderstorms developing over Missouri that could impact your final approach. Jack studied his weather radar, noting the towering cumulus clouds that were already reaching toward his flight altitude. The storm system was exactly what Dr. Foster had predicted, a fast-moving front that would complicate the final segment of the race. But storms also created opportunities for pilots skilled enough to exploit them. As Jack adjusted his course toward the developing weather, he felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that had always preceded his most challenging flights. The race was far from over, but for the first time since takeoff, Jack Sterling believed he could win. The emergency radio crackled to life as Jack crossed into Pennsylvania airspace, its urgent tone cutting through the steady drone of the F-86's engine. What he heard changed everything about the Continental Speed Challenge. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Webb Heavy declaring an emergency. Engine failure, losing altitude rapidly. Position approximately 40 miles southwest of Altoona. Jack's first instinct was competitive satisfaction. His rival's mechanical failure would virtually guarantee his victory in the speed record attempt. But as he processed the location Webb had given, a cold realization struck him. The Gulf Stream was going down in the Allegheny Mountains, one of the most unforgiving terrains on the East Coast for emergency landings. Webb Heavy, this is Philadelphia Center. State your intentions and souls on board. Single soul on board. Both engines showing severe malfunction. I'm attempting to reach Altoona Blair County Airport, but I'm not going to make it. Looking for emergency landing options in mountainous terrain. Jack switched to the emergency frequency, listening to the growing desperation in Webb's voice as air traffic controllers struggled to vector him towards suitable landing areas. The problem was simple. There weren't any. The Allegheny Mountains offered nothing but dense forest, steep ridges, and terrain that would turn any forced landing into a catastrophic crash. Sterling Heavy, Philadelphia Center. Are you monitoring the emergency frequency? Affirmative, Philadelphia. I'm tracking Webb Heavy's emergency. Sterling Heavy, you're approximately 15 miles northeast of Webb Heavy's position. Can you provide visual assistance? Jack faced the defining moment of his life. He was less than an hour from JFK Airport, on pace to break Marcus Webb's speed record and secure the prize money that would save Olivia's life. Deviating from his course to assist a downed competitor would cost him precious time and fuel, almost certainly ending his chances of victory. But as he listened to Webb's increasingly frantic radio calls, Jack heard something that transcended competition, pure human fear from a pilot facing death in the mountains below. Every principle his military training had instilled, Every value his father had taught him demanded that he respond to another aviator's distress call. Philadelphia Center. Sterling Heavy is deviating from course to provide assistance to Webb Heavy. Jack banked sharply toward Webb's last reported position, scanning the mountainous terrain below for any sign of the disabled Gulf Stream. The afternoon sun created deep shadows in the valleys, making visual searches difficult. But Jack's combat experience had taught him how to spot aircraft against complex backgrounds. Webb Heavy. This is Sterling Heavy. I have you in sight at your 2 o'clock position, approximately 3,000 feet below my altitude. You're trailing smoke from your starboard engine. Sterling Heavy. Webb's voice was strained with the effort of maintaining control of his damaged aircraft. I can't believe you came back for me. Save the gratitude for after we get you on the ground safely. What's your fuel situation? Maybe 10 minutes before flameout. I'm looking at a ridge line that might be long enough for a belly landing, but the approach angle is marginal. Jack assessed the terrain Webb was considering, a narrow ridgetop that offered perhaps 1,000 feet of relatively level ground before dropping off into steep ravines on both sides. The approach would require threading between two higher peaks while dealing with unpredictable mountain winds and the limited maneuverability of a damaged aircraft. Negative on the ridge landing, Jack transmitted. Too many variables, too much risk. There's a valley about 2 miles to your north that offers better options. Follow my lead. What followed was the most challenging piece of flying Jack had ever attempted. Using the F-86's superior maneuverability, he guided Webb's crippled Gulfstream through a series of turns that avoided the highest peaks while setting up an approach to a narrow valley that offered the best chance of survival. The rescue required every skill Jack had developed in 22 years of military flying. He became Webb's eyes and navigation system, providing constant guidance about terrain clearance, wind conditions, and optimal approach angles. The F-86's speed had to be carefully managed to stay with the slower Gulfstream, while maintaining enough altitude to avoid the mountain peaks. Sterling Heavy. You're getting too low for this terrain. Pull up and save yourself. Negative Webb Heavy. We finish this together. The emergency landing was controlled violence. Webb's Gulfstream struck the valley floor at nearly 200 miles per hour, its landing gear retracted and engines already beginning to flame out from fuel starvation. The aircraft slid across rough terrain for almost a quarter mile, shedding parts and gouging a deep furrow in the mountainside before finally coming to rest against a stand of pine trees. Jack circled the crash site, watching for signs of fire or movement from the wreckage. For long seconds, nothing stirred in the crumpled remains of what had been a $50 million business jet. Then the emergency exit opened, and Marcus Webb stumbled out, shaken but apparently uninjured. Sterling Heavy. Webb Heavy is out of the aircraft and appears to be mobile. Emergency services are en route to the crash site, but Jack's heroic rescue had come at an enormous cost. The detour had consumed 45 minutes and thousands of pounds of fuel. His arrival time at JFK would be well beyond the record pace, and his fuel reserves were now critically low. The Continental Speed Challenge was lost. As Jack set course for New York, Webb's voice came over the emergency frequency one final time. Sterling Heavy. This is Webb. I need to tell you something about your military record, about what my father did to you in Afghanistan. You saved 17 lives that day, including his. You deserved the Medal of Honor, not the cover-up he arranged. I've been living with that shame my entire adult life. Webb, we can discuss ancient history after we're both on the ground safely. No, you need to hear this now. The insurance company that denied your daughter's treatment. My family owns a controlling stake in that corporation. I personally approved the decision to deny coverage, hoping it would force you to give up the speed record attempt. Sterling, I cheated to get my record in 2016. My aircraft was modified beyond legal limits. You've already proven you're the better pilot and the better man. The confession changed nothing about Jack's immediate situation. He was still short on fuel and facing almost certain defeat in the competition. But Webb's acknowledgement of 2 decades of injustice provided a different kind of victory. one that validated every sacrifice Jack had made in service to his country and his daughter. Webb, you can make things right by testifying about what really happened. But first, let's focus on getting both of us home safely. As the New York skyline appeared on the horizon, Jack realized that some victories were more important than speed records or prize money. He had proven something to himself and the world that transcended any competition, that courage and integrity would always triumph over wealth and corruption. The F-86 fuel gauges were approaching empty, but Jack Sterling had never felt richer in his life. The new flight certificate arrived by certified mail 6 weeks after the Continental Speed Challenge, bearing the official seal of the National Aeronautic Association and Jack Sterling's name embossed in gold lettering. Despite his detour to rescue Marcus Webb, Jack had landed at JFK Airport with a transcontinental time of 3 hours, 46 minutes, and 23 seconds, exactly 37 seconds faster than Webb's previous record. The margin was impossibly thin, made possible only by the mountain wave conditions over Colorado and Jack's decision to push his fuel reserves to the absolute limit during the final approach to New York, when he'd shut down the F-86's engine on the JFK ramp. The fuel gauges read empty, and the aircraft had perhaps 3 minutes of flight time remaining. "I still can't believe the math worked out," Pete said, studying the official timing documents. 45 minutes to save Webb's life, and you still broke the record by half a minute. Jack sat in his garage workshop, the certificate propped against the same workbench where he'd spent countless hours rebuilding the F-86's engine. The aircraft itself was being prepared for permanent display at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, a fitting end for a fighter jet that had served its country in 2 wars and one impossible dream. Marcus Webb had been true to his word about making amends. Within a week of the rescue, he'd provided sworn testimony to military investigators detailing his father's role in suppressing Jack's Medal of Honor recommendation. The Pentagon Review Board had acted with unusual speed, formally upgrading Jack's Purple Heart and issuing a public apology for the 20-year injustice. More importantly, for Olivia's immediate needs, Webb had personally intervened with Metropolitan Health Services. The insurance company is family-controlled. Her treatment coverage was not only approved, but backdated to cover all previous medical expenses. The experimental gene therapy at Johns Hopkins had begun 3 weeks after the speed record flight. "How are you feeling today, sweetheart?" Jack asked, finding Olivia in the kitchen, where she was preparing lunch with steady hands that showed none of the tremors that had plagued her months earlier. "Good," she said. And for the first time in years, Jack believed she was telling the truth. The genetic therapy couldn't undo the neurological damage already caused by her condition, but it had successfully halted the disease's progression. Her balance had improved, the tremors had largely disappeared, and her energy levels were returning to normal. "Dr. Ramirez called this morning with my latest test results. All the markers are stable. She thinks I might be able to start flight training again next month." The irony wasn't lost on Jack that his record-breaking flight had ultimately saved not just Olivia's life, but also her dreams of following in his footsteps as a pilot. The experimental treatment had been so successful that Johns Hopkins was using her case as a model for treating other patients with similar conditions. 6 months later, Olivia stood beside a Cessna 172 at Palmdale Regional Airport, wearing her father's old flight helmet and preparing for her first solo flight since beginning treatment. The high school flight training program had been suspended during her illness, but her instructor had agreed to resume lessons once her medical clearance was confirmed. "Remember what your mother used to say," Jack called from beside the runway, watching his daughter complete her pre-flight inspection with the methodical precision he'd taught her years earlier. "Fear is just excitement without breath," Olivia replied. Grinning as she climbed into the pilot's seat, the Cessna's engine started with a gentle purr, nothing like the thunderous roar of the F-86's military power plant. But Jack felt the same pride watching Olivia taxi toward the runway. She'd inherited her mother's grace and determination, combined with the Sterling family's natural feel for aviation. As the small aircraft lifted off into the desert afternoon, Jack reflected on how profoundly their lives had changed since that desperate night when he'd submitted his entry to the Continental Speed Challenge. The prize money, $2 million plus endorsement deals that had followed his record-breaking flight, had secured their financial future and funded a scholarship program for military veterans, children pursuing aviation. Careers. Marcus Webb had undergone his own transformation, following the rescue and his public confession about his family's corruption. He'd sold his aviation business and devoted himself to exposing defense contracting fraud, working with congressional investigators to uncover other instances of military service records being falsified for personal gain. "Your father saved my life in more ways than one," Webb had told Olivia during a visit to their home the previous month. "He gave me the chance to become the man I should have been all along." The Congressional Medal of Honor ceremony had taken place at the White House on a crisp October morning. Exactly 1 year after the Continental Speed Challenge, President Morrison had presented the medal personally, reading the citation that finally recognized Jack's heroism in Afghanistan and the 17 lives he'd saved. "Through his courage under fire, this nation has waited too long to properly honor Colonel Sterling's service," the president had said during the ceremony. His actions in combat and his recent demonstration of courage in civilian life remind us that true heroism isn't measured in personal achievement, but in the willingness to sacrifice for others. But the moment Jack treasured most had come after the ceremony, when Olivia had pinned her father's new medal to his dress uniform with hands that were steady and strong. "I'm proud of you, Dad. Not for the record or the medal, but for teaching me that the most important victories are the ones that help other people." Now, watching his daughter practice touch-and-go landings in the same airspace where he'd learned to fly 30 years earlier, Jack felt the quiet satisfaction that came from a mission accomplished. The speed record would eventually be broken by someone else flying a more advanced aircraft. The medal was a long overdue recognition of past service, but Olivia's laughter as she executed a perfect landing in the desert afternoon, that was the victory that would last forever. The F-86 might be destined for museum display, but the Sterling family's aviation legacy was just beginning its next chapter. And this time, Jack thought, watching his daughter taxi back toward the hangar with obvious joy in her accomplishments, they were flying toward a future limited only by the endless possibilities of an open sky.